What would you do if you caught your partner, someone you've trusted for years, cheating in the middle of a family celebration? The betrayal, the shock, the heartbreak, it's all about to unfold in a way you won't believe. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything. And make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss how this story ends. It was supposed to be a night like any other, a family celebration, a moment to gather, laugh, and share memories. The kind of evening where stories are told, laughter fills the air, and the familiar warmth of loved ones wraps around you like a cozy blanket. Maria had spent weeks preparing for this dinner. The house was spotless, the table set just right, and the food, oh, the food, was perfectly laid out. She was proud of what she had done for her family, making sure everything was perfect. Her husband, Jack, was there too, of course. He was always the life of the party. His charming smile, his easy-going demeanor, his jokes that seemed to light up any room. Jack was the center of attention, and Maria loved seeing him happy. He was the man she had spent years with, the father of their children, the one she had built a life with. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way he had been looking at his phone more than usual, or the way he seemed to drift off into his thoughts when they spoke. Maria couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As the evening wore on, the family continued to enjoy themselves. The conversation flowed easily. There was talk of the kids' school projects, an upcoming family trip, and the usual banter between relatives. Yet, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of unease in her stomach. She tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just tired. After all, she had been planning this gathering for days. But as the night progressed, she found herself glancing over at Jack more than once, her mind racing with questions she hadn't wanted to ask. At one point, Maria noticed Jack stepping away from the crowd. He had excused himself to take a phone call, but there was something odd about the way he had acted. Why had he looked so flustered? Maria felt her heart rate pick up, but she told herself it was nothing. After all, Jack was a busy man, and sometimes work just couldn't wait. Yet, when he returned, his behavior seemed even more distant. He wasn't the same warm and engaging Jack she had known for years. And then there was the maid, Laura. Maria had hired her only a few months ago, but she was quickly becoming a part of the family. Laura was sweet, hardworking, and attentive, always there when something needed to be done. But that night, there was something about the way she was standing by Jack, just a little too close for comfort. Maria caught them exchanging looks more than once. At first, she brushed it off, thinking she was just being paranoid. But the more she watched, the more uneasy she became. Had Maria noticed something in the past? Had there been moments where she had questioned the way Jack had acted? It wasn't like him to be secretive, yet here he was, avoiding eye contact, his interactions with Laura just a little too familiar. Was Maria imagining things, or was there something else going on? What would you have done in Maria's place? Would you have confronted them right then and there? Or would you have continued to pretend everything was fine? Maria was torn. She didn't want to believe that her husband, the man she trusted, could be capable of such betrayal. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. And little did she know that evening would soon spiral into something she could never have predicted. As the night continued, the celebration seemed to carry on without a hitch. The laughter and chatter filled the air, but for Maria, the warmth of the gathering had started to fade. It was as if she were watching it all from the outside, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her husband, Jack, was laughing with the family, but his eyes kept darting over to Laura, the maid, who was quietly moving about the room, always just a little too close to him. Maria tried to focus on the conversation around her, but her mind kept drifting back to them. her husband and the maid. Could it be her imagination, or was there something there? She had always trusted Jack, but this was different. He had never acted this way before. Finally, as the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Maria decided she needed a moment to herself. She excused herself from the table and went upstairs to check on the children, hoping to clear her head. The house was quiet, save for the faint sounds of guests saying their goodbyes downstairs. As she walked through the hallway, she heard a noise, whispers, soft but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, not sure if she should investigate or turn around and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But the curiosity, the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, drove her forward. She quietly moved closer to the source of the sound, her breath catching as she reached the door to the living room. Through a crack in the door, she saw them, Jack and Laura, standing too close, their faces just inches apart. For a moment, Maria couldn't believe her eyes. She watched as Jack leaned in, his hand gently touching Laura's arm. Maria's pulse quickened. The whispers she had heard earlier were not just innocent chatter. They were a quiet exchange of something far more intimate. Before she could process what was happening, Jack pulled Laura even closer. Maria saw the way his hand moved to the small of her back and the way they shared a look, something that no married couple should ever share with someone else. The betrayal was plain in front of her eyes, and the world around her seemed to collapse. It felt like time stood still. She stood there, frozen, unable to move, as the truth sank in with a painful clarity. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with disbelief. She had always trusted Jack, and now here he was, acting in a way that shattered everything she thought she knew about their marriage. What was going on? Was this an affair? Or had there been something more between them for longer than she could imagine? In that moment, everything she had built her life around, the family, the love she thought she had with Jack, seemed to crumble. How could he do this to her? The anger, the hurt, the confusion all flooded in, and Maria felt as though the ground beneath her had been pulled away. What would she do now? Would she confront them both? Would she speak her mind in that moment? Or would she retreat to figure out what to do next? The choice Maria made in the coming moments would set the course for everything that followed. But one thing was certain: her life and the way she viewed her husband would never be the same again. Maria stood frozen for what seemed like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest. The sounds of the family celebration downstairs faded into nothing. All she could hear was the rush of her own thoughts, racing to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The husband she had known, the father of her children, the man she had trusted. He was standing there, so close to another woman, touching her like that. It felt like her world had tilted off its axis. Jack and Laura hadn't noticed her yet, completely absorbed in their secret moment. But Maria couldn't just stand there any longer. Every inch of her body screamed at her to do something, anything. The anger bubbled up, hot and urgent, but it was the shock that held her in place, making her question whether this was really happening. Could she be mistaken? The evidence was right in front of her. With a sudden surge of emotion, Maria pushed open the door. The sound of it creaking seemed to echo through the room, and both Jack and Laura instantly turned, their faces pale with shock. Jack's eyes widened, and Laura quickly took a step back, her hands instinctively tugging at the hem of her dress, as though trying to distance herself from what had just happened. But the damage was already done. Maria had seen enough. For a moment, there was only silence. No one spoke. Maria stood in the doorway, her fists clenched at her sides, trying to steady her breath. Jack's face shifted from surprise to guilt in the blink of an eye, but he didn't speak. Laura, on the other hand, looked helpless, her eyes darting between the two of them. It was clear that she hadn't expected Maria to walk in on them. But Maria wasn't about to let either of them off the hook that easily. Jack opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Maria wasn't interested in his excuses. She had seen enough. She had heard enough. The man she had loved for years was standing before her, and it was like a stranger had taken his place. How long? Maria's voice trembled, but it was laced with fury. Jack flinched at the question, but still he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Maria's gaze shifted to Laura. The young woman who had worked for their family, who had become a part of their home, was now standing there, her face flushed with shame. "You," Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" Laura opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She looked at Jack, then at Maria, but she didn't know how to explain herself. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it something else entirely? "I didn't mean for this to happen," Laura said weakly, but Maria wasn't ready to hear any more excuses. "What does this mean?" Maria demanded, turning back to Jack. She couldn't hold back the flood of emotions any longer. Are you seeing her behind my back? Were you planning on telling me, or was I just supposed to pretend I didn't notice?" The hurt in her voice was clear. Jack took a hesitant step forward, but Maria held up her hand, stopping him. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice sharp and filled with anger. Jack opened his mouth again, his voice quiet but full of regret. "Maria, I never meant for it to go this far. It's just—" He paused, searching for the right words, but nothing seemed to be enough. Nothing could fix what he had done. Maria wasn't interested in hearing more. The weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Jack. I've had enough of this." She could feel the tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. She wasn't going to let him see her cry. Not over this. Not over him. Laura stood there, still silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she could hide behind them. She had been caught in the web of this affair, but there was no denying her part in it. Maria's anger had turned to a cold, quiet fury, and she didn't know which one of them she wanted to confront first. Maria took a deep breath, the room spinning slightly as she tried to regain control. "I need space," she said, her voice low and steady. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving Jack and Laura standing there, unsure of what would happen next. What would you have done in Maria's place? Would you have confronted them, demanded answers, or walked away like she did? It wasn't an easy decision, and Maria knew it wasn't going to be easy to move past this. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of the fallout, and everything Maria thought she knew about her marriage, about her life, was about to change forever. The silence in the house felt unbearable. Maria had retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her as if that could somehow block out the flood of emotions threatening to overtake her. Her heart ached with betrayal, and her mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. Jack, her husband, the man she had built her life with, had betrayed her in the worst way possible, and Laura, the woman she had trusted enough to invite into their home, had crossed a line she could never forgive. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor, her thoughts swirling. How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, a one-time mistake? Or had it been something deeper, something more complicated? Maria couldn't bring herself to ask. The answers didn't matter anymore. What hurt the most was the feeling that Jack had been hiding this from her for so long, living a double life right under her nose. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but she couldn't bring herself to sleep. She couldn't face Jack, not yet. The man she had trusted, loved, and shared her life with had shattered her world in the blink of an eye. What did he expect her to do? Could they fix this? Could they even talk about it without tearing each other apart? Meanwhile, downstairs, Jack sat alone. The family had left, the guests had gone home, and the house had returned to its quiet, empty state. He hadn't followed Maria when she left the room. He knew better than to push her right now. But the silence was deafening. He couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in his mind, the moment Maria walked in on him with Laura. The guilt gnawed at him. He had betrayed the woman he had promised to love and cherish, and now he was left to face the consequences. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had broken something that couldn't be easily repaired, and no amount of apologies could take back what had happened. He couldn't even begin to understand what Maria must be feeling right now. The shock, the hurt, the sense of betrayal, it must have been overwhelming, and it was all his fault. The hours passed slowly. Jack stayed downstairs, but he didn't know what to do with himself. His thoughts kept drifting back to Laura. How had they ended up here? What started as a harmless flirtation, something innocent, had turned into something far more dangerous, more destructive. Jack had been selfish, and now he was paying the price. Upstairs, Maria couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Her anger was slowly giving way to a deep sadness. She hadn't imagined this. She had never imagined that Jack could do something like this to her. All the years they had spent together, all the trust they had built, what did it all mean now? Was their marriage just a facade, or had it really meant something? Could she even look at him the same way again? She tried to focus on something else, anything else, but her mind kept returning to the scene she had walked in on. The way Jack had looked at Laura, the way they had touched, the way they had exchanged glances like no one else existed in the room. That was the moment Maria realized that her whole world had changed, and there was no going back. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she could ever forgive Jack, or if she even wanted to. The idea of moving forward with him felt impossible, but at the same time, the thought of leaving him, of walking away from everything they had built, felt just as overwhelming. There was no easy answer, no simple solution. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She needed time. Time to think, time to decide what she wanted, what she needed. But one thing was certain. The betrayal had broken something inside of her, and the pieces could never be put back together in the same way. What would you do if you were in Maria's shoes? Would you try to work through it, or would you walk away? The pain of betrayal is one of the hardest things to face, and the decision isn't something anyone should have to make alone. The following morning was no better. The sun came up, casting a light that seemed far too bright for the heavy atmosphere that hung over the house. Maria hadn't slept at all. The events of the night before played in her mind like an endless loop, each replay making the sting of betrayal sharper. Jack had been up for hours, pacing, his mind racing, trying to find the right words, trying to figure out what he could possibly say to make it right. He knew he had to talk to Maria, but he didn't know where to start. How could he explain what had happened? How could he explain the actions of a man who had lost his way? He had always been the provider, the protector, the one who kept the family together. Now, he was the one who had torn it apart. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup in front of him. It felt like the room was closing in on him, the silence suffocating. Every tick of the clock reminded him of the hours he had wasted, the lies he had told, and the pain he had caused. He had messed up, and now he had to face the woman he had hurt the most. Finally, he stood up, his hands shaking as he grabbed his phone. He dialed Maria's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. He tried again, but the same result. She wasn't answering. He didn't blame her. What could he possibly say to make up for what he had done? But Jack wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. He left a message. his voice shaky with emotion. "Maria, please, I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you and I don't know how to make it right. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, just let me explain. Please." He ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He hoped, prayed, that she would hear the sincerity in his voice. He didn't want to lose her. Not like this. Maria sat in the quiet of the bedroom, staring out the window at the grey sky. The events of the past 24 hours had left her feeling numb, disconnected from everything. She hadn't responded to Jack's call, and she wasn't sure she could. What was there left to say? He had betrayed her in the most painful way possible. And yet, part of her still wanted to believe that it could be fixed, that their marriage wasn't beyond repair. But every time she thought about it, her mind returned to that moment, the moment she had walked in on Jack and Laura, the moment everything had changed. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. Jack had chosen someone else. It didn't matter if it was a mistake or a fleeting affair. What mattered was that he had made that choice. Maria wasn't ready to confront him yet. She didn't know what she was feeling. She needed space, time to think. Her emotions were a tangled mess of anger, hurt, confusion, and something else, fear. Fear that she wouldn't be able to trust him again. Fear that this was the beginning of the end. What would she do? Could she forgive him? Could she live with the knowledge that he had betrayed her? She had always believed in love, in loyalty, in commitment. But now, she wasn't sure if any of that mattered anymore. Was it possible to rebuild something that had been shattered so completely? Or was it better to walk away and start over? Maria knew she needed to make a decision, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. She didn't want to make a choice out of anger or hurt. She needed clarity, and that could only come with time. She had to find her own way forward, even if it meant facing a future without Jack. The house felt empty, quiet. It was as if the laughter and light of the previous night had been erased, replaced with a heavy silence that made it hard to breathe. Maria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The decision she faced seemed impossible, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, her life would never be the same again. What would you do in Maria's place? Could you forgive someone who had broken your trust so completely? Or would you choose to walk away and leave the past behind? The answers were complicated, and Maria's heart wasn't ready to make them just yet. But one thing was clear: she couldn't stay in limbo forever. A decision had to be made. Jack spent the rest of the morning in a haze, his thoughts clouded by regret and guilt. He knew that words weren't enough to undo the damage, yet he had to try. He couldn't accept that everything they had built, the years together, the family they had raised, was slipping away because of his own selfish actions. The guilt gnawed at him. Every time he thought about Maria's face, the hurt and confusion in her eyes, it felt like a physical punch in the stomach. He had tried calling her again, left a few more messages, but nothing. She was avoiding him, and he couldn't blame her. What could he possibly say that would make a difference? How could he prove to her that he regretted everything? In the meantime, he tried to go about his day, but the house felt cold and unfamiliar. Every corner, every room reminded him of what he had lost. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerator felt foreign, like it was mocking him for the mess he had made of his life. It was as though the house had once been a home, filled with love and laughter, and now it was just an empty shell. Hours passed, and Jack found himself sitting on the couch, staring at the TV without really seeing anything. His mind kept drifting back to the past, the good times, the laughter, the way Maria used to look at him. It seemed impossible that it had all come to this. How had he let it get so far? He knew he had messed up, but now all he wanted was to fix it. He had taken her for granted, and now he wasn't sure if he could ever get her back. As the evening approached, Jack found himself in the kitchen, staring at a half-prepared meal that had been meant for a family dinner. He thought about Maria's love for cooking, how she always enjoyed preparing meals for the family. Now, the thought of sitting down to dinner without her felt unbearable. His heart ached at the thought that their simple, everyday moments were now just a memory, overshadowed by his actions. He picked up his phone one last time, his finger hovering over the screen. He could try again. He could apologize one more time, beg for her forgiveness. But part of him was afraid. What if she didn't want to hear it? What if she had already made up her mind? He set the phone down. For the first time, Jack realized that he couldn't fix everything right now. All he could do was wait, hope and pray that Maria would find it in her heart to give him a chance to make it right. But in the quiet of the house, Jack knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. Maria sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the empty street outside. She had spent the entire day in a kind of emotional limbo, unable to face Jack, but unable to let go of the life they had built. The silence in the house felt suffocating, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her shoulders. She had always been a woman of action, of decisiveness, but now she found herself paralyzed by the choices she had to make. As the day wore on, she felt the loneliness seep in. The house was too quiet, too empty without the presence of Jack. She had spent so many years building a life with him that the sudden absence of his warmth, his laughter, was like a hole in her heart. But despite all of that, Maria knew she couldn't just go back to how things were. She couldn't ignore what had happened, what Jack had done. At some point, the phone rang again. Jack. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen as she debated whether to answer. Part of her wanted to scream, to tell him how much he had hurt her. But another part of her, the part that still loved him, wanted to hear his voice, to see if there was any sincerity left in the man she had once trusted. In the end, Maria decided not to pick up. She wasn't ready, but she couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. She had to make a choice. Could she forgive him? Could she live with the knowledge of what had happened, or was this the end? Her mind flashed back to the times they had shared, the quiet evenings together, the trips they had taken, the way Jack had once made her feel safe and loved. But then she thought of Laura, the way her presence had changed everything, the way she had become more than just a maid in their home. She had crossed a line, and so had Jack. Could she ever look at them the same way again? Maria stood up and walked toward the front door, her mind made up. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful. She couldn't keep running from the reality of what had happened. The future was uncertain, but Maria knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the same person she had been before this all started, and whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. Maria had spent the entire day stewing in her thoughts. The decision had been hanging over her like a cloud, too heavy to ignore any longer. She couldn't keep living in this state of confusion, holding on to a past that was slipping through her fingers. It was time to face Jack, to have the conversation they both dreaded, but knew was necessary. The thought of it made her stomach twist, but there was no other choice. She couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. The evening had settled in, the house dark and quiet. Jack was downstairs, pacing again, but this time it wasn't just guilt that weighed him down. It was the knowledge that his marriage was on the brink of falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had tried everything he could think of, apologizing, leaving messages, even sitting in the silence of the house, hoping that Maria would come to him. But nothing had worked. She hadn't said a word to him since the confrontation, and Jack couldn't stand the distance anymore. Maria made her way downstairs, her mind made up. She didn't know how this conversation would go. She didn't know what she wanted from Jack, if anything. But what she did know was that she couldn't keep living in this limbo. She had to find a way forward, even if it meant facing the truth that had been so painful to accept. Jack heard her footsteps approaching, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt his breath catch in his chest. He stood up quickly, his hands wringing together nervously. Maria didn't say anything as she entered the room, but the tension between them was thick, palpable. "Maria," Jack finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." He took a step toward her, but Maria held up a hand, stopping him. "Jack, stop," Maria said quietly, her voice calm, but laced with a hurt that she couldn't hide. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Do you even understand what you've done? Do you understand how much this has hurt me? I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. You broke something inside of me that I'm not sure can ever be fixed." Jack winced at her words, the sharpness of her pain hitting him like a slap. "I know I don't deserve your trust, and I don't know if I can ever earn it back," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I love you, Maria. I never stopped loving you." Maria didn't reply right away. She stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wanted to believe him. Part of her still did. But could she? Could she ever trust him again, after everything that had happened? She took a deep breath, looking at him one last time. "I don't know, Jack. I really don't know. I'm not sure if I can just go back to how things were. And I'm not sure I even want to try." Jack's face fell as the reality of her words sank in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug with a few apologies. Maria was right. She couldn't just forget it. And neither could he. Their lives had been changed in ways that couldn't be undone. But as Maria turned to walk away, she paused. For a brief moment, she thought about what life could be like without him. The pain of betrayal was still there, heavy and raw. But the thought of walking away entirely made her feel both free and heartbroken. She wasn't ready to make that decision yet. Maybe she never would be. "I need time, Jack," she said softly, her back still turned to him. "I need space to think about what comes next. Don't try to convince me right now, please." Jack nodded, his heart breaking at her words. He had no choice but to let her go, to give her the time she needed. Maria walked up the stairs, leaving Jack standing in the living room, his world crashing down around him. The days that followed were filled with silence. Maria kept her distance from Jack, needing time and space to think. She had a lot to process, and it was clear that there was no easy path forward. Her emotions were still raw: anger, confusion, betrayal. Jack's apologies hadn't made the hurt go away, and neither had his promises. They felt empty, meaningless, no matter how sincere he sounded. For Jack, the silence was a form of torture. He spent his days trying to figure out how he had gotten here, how he had lost the woman he loved. He didn't have the answers. He couldn't fix what had happened, but he was willing to try. He spent hours thinking about what he could have done differently, but there were no clear answers. He had hurt Maria, and nothing could take that pain away. Maria, on the other hand, struggled with the decision she had to make. The life she had known, the future she had imagined with Jack, was in tatters. The thought of continuing their marriage, of trying to rebuild the trust that had been broken, seemed impossible. But the idea of leaving him, of walking away from everything they had built together, wasn't easy either. Days turned into weeks, and Maria found herself questioning everything. Could she forgive Jack? Could she find it in herself to trust him again? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no perfect answer. The road ahead would be difficult, no matter what she chose, but she had to make a choice, and whatever that choice was, it would shape her future. She wasn't sure yet if she was ready to forgive Jack, but she knew one thing: she had to move forward, whether with him or without him. The path ahead was uncertain, but Maria was determined to find her way, one step at a time. Days passed, but the silence between Maria and Jack remained unbroken. The house felt like a shell, a reminder of everything that had fallen apart. It was a strange, suffocating kind of stillness, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Maria knew that this silence could only last so long. She had spent enough time thinking, enough time in limbo. The time had come to make a decision, whether she was ready for it or not. One evening, after yet another quiet dinner, Maria sat in the living room, her thoughts swirling. Jack had been distant, still apologetic, but Maria could sense that he, too, was waiting for something, waiting for her to say the words that would either mend their shattered marriage or bring it to a final end. Jack sat across from her, his eyes searching hers, filled with the same desperation he had shown from the beginning. He hadn't given up, not completely, but Maria could see the exhaustion in him, the way the weight of his actions was starting to show. He was a man on the edge, and Maria knew that if she didn't make a decision soon, the consequences would only grow heavier for both of them. "Maria," Jack began, his voice softer than usual, full of vulnerability. "I know it's not enough. I know I can't just expect you to forgive me. But I'm here. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Please, just tell me what you need. If I can fix this, I will. If you want space, I'll give it to you. If you want me to leave, I will. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Maria looked at him, her heart heavy. The truth was, she wasn't sure what she wanted. The hurt was still there, the anger still fresh, but there was also a part of her that wanted to believe in the man she had once loved. Could they really rebuild their life? Or was this a bridge too far to cross? She thought about everything, about their years together, their children, the life they had built. She thought about the way Jack had once held her, the way he had promised to never hurt her. And she thought about the broken trust. Could she forgive him? Could she move past it? Was it possible to heal? Jack waited for her response, his breath held, the anticipation in his eyes. He had said all the right things, but he knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. It was Maria's decision now, the one that would shape their future. Maria took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Jack. I don't know if I can trust you again. But what I do know is that I can't keep living in this in-between. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine, or that we can just go back to the way things were." She paused, feeling the weight of her words. "I need time. I need time to figure out what I want. I need to find myself again. Whether or not we can move forward, that's something I have to decide on my own." Jack nodded, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had hoped for a definitive answer, but Maria's honesty was the first step towards something real, something that didn't rely on false promises or expectations. "I understand," he whispered. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." And with that, Maria knew that her journey had only just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was determined to find her way, whether with Jack or without him. The healing would take time, and the road would be difficult, but Maria knew that she had to do this for herself. She had to reclaim her strength, her sense of self. As she stood up and walked out of the room, she felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of the unknown, of the future that lay ahead, but also hope that no matter what happened, she would find her peace. Whether it was with Jack or without him, she would move forward, one step at a time. The final choice had been made, not by the past or the hurt, but by Maria's own determination to rebuild herself, to find her strength again. And that, more than anything, would shape the future ahead.